The coffee that changed everything. I never imagined that running away from my life in Marrakesh would lead me to the most remote village in Finland, or that a cup of coffee would become the bridge between two completely different worlds. My name is Youssef Ben Ali, and 6 months ago I was a successful marketing executive in Morocco, living the life my family had always envisioned for me. Today, I'm standing in the middle of a Finnish forest, surrounded by snow that reaches my knees, wondering how I ended up falling in love with a man who barely speaks and whose idea of excitement is identifying different types of pine trees. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, from the moment everything in my carefully planned life began to unravel. It was a Tuesday morning in March when I walked into my manager's office in Marrakesh and handed in my resignation. Ahmed, who had been my supervisor for 3 years, stared at the letter like it was written in a foreign language. "Youssef, what is this about? You're our best account manager. The promotion to regional director is practically guaranteed next month." I had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times, but sitting there in that familiar office, with the sounds of the Medina drifting through the windows and the scent of mint tea lingering in the air, I struggled to find the right words. "I need a change, Ahmed. I need to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be who everyone expects me to be." It was the closest I could come to the truth. How could I explain that at 28, I felt like I was suffocating in a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt hollow inside? How could I tell him that every family dinner where my mother mentioned potential wives, every business meeting where I had to laugh at jokes about women and marriage, every moment where I had to perform heterosexuality felt like another small death? I had been having the same recurring dream for months. I was standing in a vast, empty space. Sometimes it was a desert, sometimes a forest, sometimes just endless white snow. In the dream, I was completely alone, but for the first time in my life, I could breathe freely. I would wake up with tears on my cheeks and a desperate longing for that feeling of space and solitude. The decision to leave Morocco hadn't been easy. My family was devastated, convinced that I was having some kind of mental breakdown. My father, a traditional man who had built his small textile business through decades of hard work, couldn't understand why his eldest son would abandon a successful career to find himself in Europe. "Europe will change you, Youssef," he had said during our last conversation before I left. "You'll come back different, and not in a good way." Maybe he was right, but I was hoping that was exactly what would happen. I had originally planned to go to Paris, where I had some college friends and where my French language skills would be useful. But something about the predictability of that choice felt wrong. If I was going to reinvent my life, I wanted to do it somewhere completely unexpected, somewhere that would force me to become someone new. That's how I ended up researching the most remote places in Europe where I could legally live and work. Finland kept appearing in my searches, particularly the northern regions where the population density was so low that you could go days without seeing another human being. The idea both terrified and thrilled me. I spent weeks researching small Finnish towns, looking for places where an outsider might be able to establish a business. That's when I discovered Korkeasaari, a village of fewer than 300 people in the middle of Lapland, about 2 hours north of Rovaniemi. The village had a small general store, a post office that was only open 3 days a week, and no cafe or restaurant of any kind. The lack of coffee shops in a place where temperatures regularly dropped below -30 degrees Celsius seemed like either a massive oversight or a business opportunity. I decided to view it as the latter. The process of moving to Finland was bureaucratic and complicated, but having a business plan helped with the visa applications. I had saved enough money from my marketing job to purchase a small property in Korkeasaari and convert it into a cafe. The building had been a bakery until the previous owner retired 5 years earlier, so it already had commercial kitchen equipment and the necessary permits. I arrived in Korkeasaari on a gray October morning, when the autumn colors were fading and the first hints of winter were beginning to show in the shortened daylight. The village was even smaller than I had imagined, with scattered wooden houses connected by a single main road and surrounded by endless forest. My new home was a compact 2-story building on the edge of the village center. The ground floor would become the cafe, and I would live in the small apartment upstairs. The previous owner, an elderly man named Pavo, had left some furniture and kitchen equipment, along with a note in broken English welcoming me to the village and warning me about the harsh winters ahead. The first month was the loneliest period of my life. My Finnish was limited to basic phrases learned from language apps, and while most of the villagers spoke some English, conversations were stilted and brief. I spent my days working on renovations, painting walls, refinishing floors, learning how to operate the industrial coffee machine I had shipped from Germany. The physical work was therapeutic in a way I hadn't expected. In Marrakesh, my job had been entirely mental, analyzing market trends, creating presentations, managing client relationships. Here, I was using my hands to build something tangible, something that was entirely my own creation. But the isolation was overwhelming. I would go entire days speaking only to the postal worker who delivered supplies or the elderly man who ran the general store. I had expected solitude, but I hadn't anticipated how much I would miss casual human interaction. The small talk with colleagues, the background chatter in restaurants, even the arguments with my family that I had found so suffocating. I started taking long walks in the forest surrounding the village, partly for exercise and partly because the silence of the trees felt less oppressive than the silence of my empty cafe. The Finnish forest was unlike anything I had experienced in Morocco, where the landscapes of my childhood were defined by earth tones and stark contrasts between light and shadow. Here everything was soft greens and browns, with light that filtered through branches in gentle, shifting patterns. It was during one of these walks, about 6 weeks after my arrival, that I first encountered Michael Vertanen. I had been following a trail that led deeper into the forest than I had ventured before, enjoying the crunch of fallen leaves under my feet and the crisp air that made my breath visible in small puffs. I was so focused on the path ahead that I didn't notice the man until I was almost on top of him. He was kneeling beside a large pine tree, making notes in a small notebook, completely absorbed in his work. When he looked up at the sound of my footsteps, I found myself staring into the bluest eyes I had ever seen, the kind of pale, clear blue that seemed to reflect the northern sky. He was probably in his early 30s, with light brown hair that was slightly too long and looked like it had been cut with more attention to practicality than style. His face was angular and weathered in a way that suggested he spent most of his time outdoors, and he was wearing the kind of functional outdoor clothing that marked him as someone who worked in the forest professionally. "Sorry," I said in English, feeling awkward for interrupting whatever he was doing. "I didn't realize anyone else was out here." He studied me for a moment with those remarkable eyes, and I had the strange feeling that he was cataloging details about me the same way he had been cataloging whatever he was studying about the tree. "You're the new cafe owner," he said finally, in English that was accented but clear. "Youssef." The fact that he knew my name shouldn't have been surprising. In a village of 300 people, the arrival of a Moroccan coffee shop owner was probably the most interesting thing that had happened in years. But something about the way he said my name, with careful attention to the pronunciation, made my heart skip slightly. "Yes, that's me. And you are?" "Michael Vertanen. I'm the local forester." He gestured toward the tree he had been examining. "Checking for signs of disease before winter sets in." We stood there for a moment in the kind of silence that would have been uncomfortable in most contexts, but somehow felt natural in the quiet of the forest. Michael seemed perfectly content to wait for me to speak first, which I eventually did. "I'm still learning about the area," I said. "The forest is incredible. So different from what I'm used to." "Where are you used to?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Morocco. Marrakesh, specifically." He nodded thoughtfully. "That's quite a change. What brought you to Korkiasari?" It was a reasonable question, but one I still struggled to answer honestly. "I needed something completely different," I said finally. "And it doesn't get much more different than this." A smile flickered across his face, the first real expression I had seen from him. "No, it doesn't." We talked for another few minutes about the forest, the village, and the coming winter. Michael's English was careful and precise, and he seemed to choose his words with the same attention he gave to examining trees. But underneath his reserved manner, I sensed a dry sense of humor and a genuine curiosity about my presence in his remote corner of the world. When we parted ways, he mentioned that he was looking forward to trying the cafe when it opened, and something about the way he said it made me more determined than ever to create something special. The next few weeks passed in a blur of final preparations. I had decided to open the cafe in early December, reasoning that the onset of winter would make a warm, welcoming space more appealing to the locals. I worked 16-hour days, perfecting recipes, arranging furniture, and learning the intricacies of Finnish business regulations. The menu I developed was a careful balance between familiar comfort foods and subtle nods to my Moroccan heritage. The coffee program was extensive. I had invested in high-quality beans from multiple regions and spent hours learning to use the espresso machine properly. But I also offered mint tea prepared the way my grandmother had taught me, and pastries that were influenced by both French and North African traditions. 3 days before the planned opening, I was arranging chairs when I heard a knock at the door. Through the glass, I could see a familiar figure, Michael, holding what appeared to be a small wrapped package. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said when I opened the door. "I brought you something for the opening." The package contained a small wooden sign, hand-carved with the name I had chosen for the cafe, Kavila Sahara, a combination of the Finnish word for cafe and a reference to my desert homeland. "I thought you might want something that connected both places," he said, his cheeks slightly flushed either from the cold or from embarrassment. I was touched by the gesture, but what struck me even more was the craftsmanship. The carving was beautiful, with clean lines and a smooth finish that spoke of skill and patience. "You made this yourself?" I asked, running my fingers over the smooth wood. "It's just a hobby," he said, but I could see the pride in his eyes. "I work with wood in the evenings sometimes." "It's beautiful, Michael." "Thank you." We stood there for a moment and I felt something shift between us, a recognition that this was more than just a neighborly gesture. There was care in this gift, attention to detail that suggested he had been thinking about me and my cafe more than casual interest would warrant. "Would you like to see the rest of the place?" I asked. "I could make you a coffee test run before the official opening." He accepted, and I gave him a tour of the small space I had created. The cafe was warm and inviting, with exposed wooden beams, soft lighting, and comfortable seating areas that encouraged lingering. I had hung some photographs of Moroccan landscapes alongside pictures of Finnish forests, creating a visual dialogue between my two worlds. "It feels like you," Michael said as we settled at a table with our coffee. "Like both places at once." The observation was more perceptive than I had expected, and it made me look at him with new interest. In Morocco, I had been surrounded by people who were quick to speak, who filled silences with words and gestures. Michael's quietness had initially made me uncertain about how to interpret his thoughts, but now I was beginning to understand that his silence was thoughtful rather than empty. "How long have you lived in Korkeasaari?" I asked. "My whole life," he said. "I grew up here, left for university in Helsinki, came back 5 years ago when the previous forester retired." "Do you ever think about leaving again?" He considered the question seriously. "Sometimes, but this forest, this place, it's part of who I am. I can't imagine living anywhere else." He paused. "What about you? Do you think you'll stay?" It was a question I had been avoiding, both from others and from myself. "I don't know," I admitted. "I came here to figure some things out about myself. But I'm starting to think that maybe what I needed wasn't just space to think, but space to become someone new." "And are you becoming someone new?" I looked around the cafe, at this space I had created from nothing, at this man whose quiet presence was beginning to feel like home. "Yes," I said. "I think I am." The cafe's opening day was more successful than I had dared to hope. Word had spread throughout the village, and a steady stream of customers came throughout the day to try the coffee and pastries. Many of them spoke enough English to offer encouragement and welcome, and I was touched by their genuine warmth. Michael arrived in the late afternoon, when the initial rush had died down and I was beginning to feel the exhaustion of my first day as a business owner. He ordered a simple black coffee and one of the almond pastries I had made using a recipe adapted from my grandmother's malmul. "How was the first day?" he asked, settling into the same chair he had occupied during his preview visit. "Overwhelming," I said, pouring myself a cup of tea and joining him. "Good overwhelming, but still overwhelming. The village needs this," he said, looking around at the warm, welcoming space. We've been missing a gathering place. Somewhere people can come just to be around others. I was beginning to understand that Michael didn't speak casually. When he offered an observation or opinion, it was because he had thought about it carefully and decided it was worth sharing. This trait, which might have made him seem reserved or cold in other contexts, actually made his words carry more weight. "What about you?" I asked. "Do you need a gathering place? Or are you happy with the solitude of the forest?" "I love the forest," he said, "but I'm not a hermit. I just choose my company carefully." The way he said it, with a slight emphasis on choose, made me wonder if there was more to his story. In a village this small, I was beginning to realize everyone had a story, and many of them were more complex than they appeared on the surface. As the weeks passed and winter settled over Korkiasari in earnest, the cafe became an established part of the village rhythm. I learned the names and preferences of my regular customers, picked up more Finnish vocabulary through daily conversations, and gradually began to feel like I belonged somewhere for the first time in my adult life. Michael became my most reliable customer, stopping by almost every afternoon when he finished his work in the forest. He would order the same black coffee, sit in the same chair, and we would talk about everything from forest management to Moroccan cooking techniques to the books we were reading. I began to look forward to these conversations more than I wanted to admit. There was something about Michael's quiet intelligence and dry humor that drew me in, something about the way he listened with complete attention that made me feel heard in a way I rarely had before. It was during one of these afternoon conversations, about 2 months after the cafe opened, that I first sensed there might be something deeper developing between us. We were discussing a book about Arctic exploration that Michael had recommended, and I was telling him about my own experiences with extreme weather during childhood trips to the Atlas Mountains. The conversation had evolved into a broader discussion about how landscapes shape people, and I found myself being more personal than usual. "In Morocco, I always felt like I was performing," I said, surprised by my own honesty. Like there was a script I was supposed to follow, and everyone was watching to make sure I hit my marks correctly. Michael nodded thoughtfully. "What kind of script?" "Successful career, marriage to a nice girl, children, taking over my father's business eventually. All good things, things that would make my family proud and secure my place in society. But none of it felt like me. And here I can just be. I don't have to perform masculinity or success or heterosexuality. I can just exist as myself." The word heterosexuality hung in the air between us, and I realized that I had accidentally revealed more than I had intended. I had never explicitly discussed my sexual orientation with anyone in the village, partly because it hadn't seemed relevant and partly because I was still figuring out how much of my true self I was ready to reveal. Michael's expression didn't change, but I saw something shift in his eyes. Not judgment or surprise, but recognition. "Performance can be exhausting," he said quietly, "even when you're good at it." The way he said it made me think he was speaking from experience, and suddenly I found myself wondering about Michael's own story. In the months I had known him, he had never mentioned dating anyone, never referred to a girlfriend or romantic interest of any kind. In a village this small, that kind of privacy was unusual unless it was intentional. "Have you ever felt like you were performing?" I asked carefully. He was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the snow-covered forest. When he finally spoke, his voice was even softer than usual. "In Helsinki, during university, I tried to be the person I thought I was supposed to be. Dated women, went to parties, acted like the other forestry students. But it never felt right. When I came back here, I decided I would rather be alone and honest than connected and fake." The admission was the most personal thing he had ever shared with me, and I could see that it had cost him something to say it. I felt a surge of gratitude for his trust, and something else, a flutter of possibility that I tried not to examine too closely. "Are you lonely?" I asked. "I was," he said, meeting my eyes directly for the first time during the conversation. "Less so lately." That night, I lay in bed thinking about our conversation and what it might mean. I had come to Finland to escape the complications of identity and desire, but now I was facing the possibility that I might have found something I hadn't been looking for. A connection with someone who understood the cost of authenticity. The next few weeks passed with a new awareness between us. Our daily conversations continued, but there was an undercurrent of something unspoken, a recognition that we were both navigating carefully around feelings that neither of us was quite ready to name. I found myself paying attention to small details. The way Michael's eyes crinkled slightly when he was amused, the careful way he handled my grandmother's tea glass, the fact that he always stayed until closing time and helped me clean up without being asked. It was during one of these end-of-day cleaning sessions that something finally shifted. I was washing dishes in the small kitchen while Michael swept the cafe floor, and we were talking about plans for the village's upcoming winter festival. The conversation was comfortable and mundane, but I was intensely aware of his presence in the space, of the domestic rhythm we had developed. "Youssef," he said suddenly, and something in his tone made me turn around. He was standing in the doorway between the cafe and the kitchen, holding the broom but not using it, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Yes, I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how to say it properly." My heart started beating faster, though I tried to keep my expression neutral. "Just say it. I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between us, simple and direct in the way that was so characteristic of Michael. No elaborate speeches or dramatic gestures, just honest truth offered with the same careful consideration he brought to everything else. I set down the dish I was washing and turned to face him fully. Looking at him standing there, this quiet, thoughtful man who had become such an important part of my daily life, I realized that I had been falling in love with him too, gradually and then all at once. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," I said. He smiled then, the first completely unguarded expression I had ever seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. Without thinking, I crossed the small space between us, and he met me halfway. When we kissed for the first time, standing in my small cafe kitchen with the smell of coffee and cardamom in the air, and the Finnish winter howling outside, it felt like coming home and setting out on an adventure all at once. The next few months were a period of quiet discovery. We took our time getting to know each other in this new context, exploring the shift from friendship to romance with the same careful attention Michael brought to his work in the forest. I learned that he was an incredibly tender lover, attentive and patient in ways that made me understand how much he had been holding back during our months of friendship. I learned that he talked more when we were alone together, that his dry humor extended to playful teasing, that he had strong opinions about everything from coffee preparation to environmental policy, but rarely shared them unless asked directly. He learned that I was more vulnerable than my confident exterior suggested, that I had spent so many years performing masculinity that I sometimes forgot what my authentic reactions were. He learned that I cooked when I was nervous, that I had never been in love before and wasn't sure I was doing it right, that I was still afraid that happiness this profound couldn't possibly last. The village accepted our relationship with the kind of matter-of-fact pragmatism that seemed characteristic of rural Finnish culture. If anyone was surprised or disapproving, they kept it to themselves. Most people seemed genuinely pleased that 2 of their bachelor residents had found companionship, and several of the older customers made a point of telling me how happy Michael seemed lately. Spring came late to Lapland, but when it finally arrived, it was like witnessing a miracle. The snow that had covered everything for months began to melt, revealing green shoots and early wildflowers. The days grew longer rapidly, and by May, the sun barely set at all. Michael took me deeper into the forest than I had ever been, showing me places that were special to him. A hidden lake where he liked to sit and think, a grove of ancient pines that he said were the oldest trees in the region, a small cabin that his grandfather had built for summer fishing trips. "I used to come here when I was trying to figure out if I could stay in Korkeasaari," he told me as we sat on the cabin's small porch, watching the sun paint the lake in shades of gold and pink. "After university, when I wasn't sure if I could build a life here that felt authentic." "What helped you decide?" "I realized that authenticity isn't about the place you're in, it's about being honest about who you are wherever you happen to be. I could be gay and happy in Helsinki, but I could also be gay and happy here if I was willing to stop hiding." I understood what he meant. My own journey to authenticity had taken me across continents, but the real work had been internal, learning to accept myself rather than constantly trying to become someone else. "Do you ever think about the future?" I asked. "About what we're building together?" Every day, he said simply. Do you? I think about expanding the cafe. Maybe adding some guest rooms upstairs for tourists who want to experience the real Lapland. I think about learning to cross-country ski properly so I can keep up with you in the winter. I think about what it would be like to stay here permanently, to make this place my real home. And what conclusion do you reach? I looked at him, this man who had helped me discover parts of myself I hadn't known existed, who had shown me that love could be quiet and steady and still transform everything. I think I want to try, I said. I think I want to build something lasting here with you. The smile that spread across his face was answer enough, but he said the words anyway. I want that too. As we sat together on that porch, watching the midnight sun paint the forest in impossible colors, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. I had come to Finland running away from a life that didn't fit, hoping to find space to become someone new. Instead, I had found something I hadn't been looking for. A love that was both peaceful and passionate. A partner who understood that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply be yourself. The cafe was thriving, becoming a real gathering place for the community. Michael's work with sustainable forestry was gaining recognition beyond the region. We were talking about traveling together. He wanted to visit Morocco to see the landscapes that had shaped me, and I wanted to explore more of Finland with him as my guide. But mostly, we were learning to be happy in the simple, ordinary moments. Morning coffee before work, evening walks in the forest, quiet conversations that lasted until the sun rose again. We were learning that love didn't have to be dramatic to be profound, that the most meaningful connections are often the ones that feel like home. Looking back now, I can see that my flight from Morocco wasn't really about escape. It was about having the courage to go toward something, even when I didn't know what that something was. I had needed to travel to the most remote corner of Europe to discover that what I was looking for wasn't solitude or adventure, but the freedom to love and be loved as my authentic self. And in the arms of a quiet Finnish forester, surrounded by coffee beans and pine trees, I had found exactly that. But as any love story worth telling will show you, finding happiness is only the beginning. Learning to keep it, to nurture it through challenges and changes, to build something that can weather the storms life inevitably brings. That's where the real work begins. Our first major test came during our second winter together. By then, Michael had essentially moved into the apartment above the cafe, though he maintained his own small house at the edge of the forest for his workshop and the times when he needed solitude. We had settled into a rhythm that felt natural and sustainable. He would leave early for his work in the forest, I would open the cafe, and we would spend our evenings together, cooking dinner and talking about our days. It was during one of the coldest weeks of February that I received a phone call that would shake the foundation of the life we had built together. My mother's voice, crackling through the international connection, carried news that made my hands tremble as I held the phone. Your father has been diagnosed with cancer, she said, her usually strong voice thin with worry. The doctors say it's treatable, but Youssef, he needs surgery, and the recovery will be long. He's asking for you. I stood in my cafe kitchen, surrounded by the warmth and comfort I had created, feeling like the floor was shifting beneath my feet. My father and I had barely spoken since I left Morocco 2 years earlier. Our last conversation had been tense, filled with his disappointment about my abandoning my career and his fears about what Europe would do to me. But despite our differences, despite the pain and misunderstanding that had driven me away, he was still my father. And my mother's voice carried an undertone that told me more than her words. She was scared, and she needed me to come home. How long? I asked, though I wasn't sure if I was asking about his prognosis or how long I would need to stay. The surgery is scheduled for next week. The doctors say if everything goes well, he should be able to return to work in 3 to 4 months. But Youssef, someone needs to manage the business while he recovers. Your brothers are too young, and I don't understand the financial side of things. My father's textile business was small but had supported our family for over 20 years. The idea of it failing while he fought for his health was unthinkable, but the idea of leaving Finland, leaving Michael, leaving the life I had built here, felt equally impossible. When Michael came home that evening, he found me sitting at our kitchen table, staring at my phone and the flight booking website I had open on my laptop. What's wrong? He asked immediately. reading the distress in my posture. I told him about the phone call, about my father's diagnosis, about the impossible choice I was facing. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as he understood the implications. "You have to go," he said when I finished. "Family is family, Youssef. Your father needs you. But what about us? What about the cafe? I can't just abandon everything we've built here." Michael was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him thinking through the practical and emotional challenges we were facing. "The cafe will survive a few months with help from the village," he said finally. "Mrs. Korhonen used to run the bakery. She could manage the basic operations. And Pavo's son knows about coffee machines from his time working in Rovaniemi." "That's not what I'm worried about," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "I'm worried about us. Long-distance relationships are hard enough without adding family crisis and cultural pressure. What if I go back to Morocco and remember why I left? What if my family convinces me that this life with you is just a phase, something I need to grow out of?" Michael reached across the table and took my hands in his. His fingers were warm and steady, calloused from his work in the forest, and holding them helped ground me in the moment. "Youssef, do you remember what you told me about authenticity? About how it's not about the place you're in, but about being honest about who you are wherever you happen to be?" I nodded, recognizing my own words reflected back to me. "This is your chance to prove that, to show yourself and your family that who you've become isn't dependent on being in Finland. You're the same person who built this cafe, who learned to love without fear, who chose happiness over expectation. That person exists whether you're here or in Marrakesh. And what about you? What if I'm gone for months? What if the distance changes things between us?" He smiled, that gentle, knowing expression that I had come to love so much. "Then we'll deal with it. But I don't think it will. Love that's real doesn't disappear because of geography." 3 days later, I was on a plane to Morocco, leaving behind the Finnish winter for the warmth of North Africa. The transition was jarring from the quiet, snow-covered landscape of Lapland to the bustling, colorful chaos of Marrakesh. Everything felt simultaneously familiar and foreign, like visiting a place I had once lived in a dream. My family's reception was complex. My mother embraced me with tears of relief, grateful to have her eldest son home during a crisis. My younger brothers, now in their early 20s, seemed genuinely excited to see me and curious about my life in Finland. But my father, pale and diminished by his illness, looked at me with a mixture of love and disappointment that was painful to witness. "You look different," he said during our first conversation in the hospital room where he was preparing for surgery. "Thinner. Are they feeding you properly in that cold country?" "I'm fine, Papa. I eat well. I cook for myself now." "A man shouldn't have to cook for himself," he said, and I could hear the old arguments lurking beneath his words. "A man should have a wife to take care of him, children to carry on his name." I had prepared for this conversation during the long flight, but sitting there in that sterile hospital room, looking at my father's vulnerable state, I found it harder than I had expected to hold onto my convictions. "I'm happy, Papa. I've built a good life there. I have a business, friends, someone who cares about me. Someone." His eyes sharpened with interest and concern. What kind of someone? This was the moment I had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. For 2 years, I had been living authentically in Finland, but I had never explicitly told my family about Michael, about the real reason I couldn't imagine returning to Morocco permanently. "Someone I love," I said carefully. "Someone who loves me." My father studied my face, and I could see him reading between the lines of what I wasn't saying directly. "Youssef," he said quietly, "what exactly have you become in that place?" "I've become myself, Papa. For the first time in my life, I've become who I really am." We didn't finish that conversation then. The nurses came to prepare him for surgery, and the next several hours were focused on medical procedures and waiting for news. But I could see that my words had given him something to think about beyond his physical recovery. The surgery went well, but my father's recovery was slow and complicated. What we had initially hoped would be a few weeks stretched into months, and I found myself deeply involved in managing his business while he regained his strength. The work was familiar. I had grown up around the textile trade and had the business training to handle the financial and administrative challenges. But being back in that world, surrounded by the expectations and assumptions of Moroccan business culture, was exhausting in ways I had forgotten. Every day brought small compromises and performances. Business meetings where I had to deflect questions about why I wasn't married. Family gatherings where relatives made comments about finding me a nice girl now that I was back home. Social situations where I had to laugh at jokes and comments that felt like small betrayals of the person I had become in Finland. I spoke with Michael every few days, usually late at night when the time difference worked and I could find privacy. These conversations became lifelines, reminders of who I was when I wasn't performing for others. "How are you holding up?" he asked during one particularly difficult week, when my father had suffered a setback in his recovery and I was facing the possibility of staying in Morocco even longer. "I'm tired," I admitted. "I love my family, and I'm glad I could be here for them during this crisis. But I feel like I'm slowly disappearing. Like every day I spend here makes it harder to remember who I was in Finland." "You're still that person," Michael said firmly. "The circumstances are different, but you're still you. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. What if I've been fooling myself? What if the person I was in Finland was just a reaction to being in a different place, and this is who I really am?" "Youssef." His voice was gentle but clear. "Do you remember the first time you told me you loved me?" I closed my eyes, thinking back to that evening in the cafe kitchen, the certainty I had felt in that moment. Yes. Did that feel like a lie? Did that feel like something you were making up or trying on like clothes? No. It felt like the truest thing I had ever said. Then trust that. Trust what you know to be real, even when it's hard to hold on to. After 4 months in Morocco, my father was finally well enough to return to work part-time, and we had hired additional help to manage the business during his continued recovery. The crisis that had brought me home was resolving, but now I faced a different kind of pressure. "You should stay," my mother said one evening as we sat in the courtyard she had mentioned during my early phone calls with Michael. "Your father needs you here. The business needs you. And Youssef, you're 30 years old. It's time to start thinking about marriage, about giving us grandchildren." "Mama, I have a life in Finland, a business, responsibilities. A coffee shop in a village where no one knows your name? That's not a life for a man like you. You could do so much more here with your family, in the place where you belong." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of my life. I tried to explain about the cafe, about the community I had found in Korkeasaari, about the person I had become there. But every explanation seemed to reinforce their conviction that I had been wasting my potential in self-imposed exile. Finally, I realized that there was only one way to make them understand why I couldn't stay, why returning to Finland wasn't just a choice but a necessity for my survival as an authentic person. "Mama," I said, taking her hands in mine, "I need to tell you something about my life in Finland, about who I really am." Over the next hour, I told my mother about Michael. I told her about falling in love with a man, about building a relationship that had given me more happiness and peace than I had ever thought possible. I told her about the community that had accepted us, about the life we were trying to build together. Her reaction was everything I had feared and expected. Shock, denial, arguments about religion and family honor, tears and accusations that Europe had corrupted me, that this was a phase I would grow out of if I just stayed home and tried to be normal. "This isn't who you are, Youssef," she said through her tears. "This is what that place has done to you. If you stay here, if you let us help you find a good wife, you'll remember who you really are." "Mama, this is who I really am. I've never been happier or more myself than I am with Michael. I love you. I love this family. But I can't sacrifice my authentic self to make others comfortable." The conversation ended badly, with both of us crying and my mother unable to accept what I had told her. Over the next few days, the news spread through our extended family, creating exactly the kind of scandal and shame I had tried to avoid by leaving Morocco in the first place. Some relatives were openly hostile, others simply stopped speaking to me. A few family friends made pointed comments about the importance of traditional values and the dangers of Western influence. My father, still recovering from his surgery, seemed caught between his love for me and his inability to understand or accept this aspect of my identity. "I just want you to be happy," he said during one of our last conversations before I left. "But I don't understand how this path can lead to happiness. What kind of future can you have with another man? What kind of legacy will you leave?" "Papa, I'm already happy. I found someone who loves me, who supports my dreams, who makes me want to be the best version of myself. Isn't that what you want for all your children?" He didn't have an answer for that, and I could see that despite his traditional beliefs, he was struggling with the reality that his son was healthier and more fulfilled than he had ever been, even if it wasn't in the way he had expected or hoped for. When I finally boarded the plane back to Finland 6 months after I had left, I was emotionally exhausted but clearer than ever about my priorities. The time in Morocco had been painful but necessary. It had forced me to defend my choices and my identity in the most challenging possible context, and I had emerged with a deeper understanding of who I was and what I was willing to sacrifice to maintain that authenticity. The flight from Casablanca to Helsinki felt like traveling between two different versions of myself, but this time I wasn't fleeing one to find the other. I was returning to the life I had chosen with full knowledge of what I was leaving behind and what I was choosing to embrace. Michael was waiting for me at the airport, holding a small sign with my name written in Arabic script, a detail that made my heart skip and reminded me why I had fallen in love with this thoughtful, caring man. When I saw him standing there, solid and patient as always, I felt like I could breathe fully for the first time in months. "Welcome home," he said when I reached him, and the word home had never felt more accurate or more precious. The drive back to Korkeasari was quiet, both of us processing the reality that we were together again after 6 months of uncertainty. The Finnish landscape, covered in late spring snow, looked like paradise after the intensity of my time in Morocco. "How was it really?" Michael asked as we neared the village. "Harder than I expected," I said honestly, "but necessary. I needed to know if what we have could survive that kind of test, if I could maintain my identity under that kind of pressure." And I told them about us, about you, about who I really am. He glanced at me with surprise and concern. "How did they react?" "About as well as you'd expect. My mother thinks you've corrupted me. My father thinks I'm throwing my life away. Most of my extended family thinks I've lost my mind." "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know how much you hoped they would understand." "I'm not sorry," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. For the first time in my relationship with my family, I was completely honest. They may not accept it, they may not understand it, but they know who I really am. That feels like progress, even if it's painful. We spent the next few days reacquainting ourselves with each other and with the rhythm of our shared life. The cafe had survived my absence. Mrs. Korhonen and Pavo's son had kept it running with help from other villagers, and while it wasn't quite the same as when I was there, it had continued to serve as a gathering place for the community. "We missed you," Mrs. Korhonen told me on my first day back. The coffee was adequate, but it didn't have the same heart. Returning to work felt like putting on comfortable clothes after months of formal wear. The familiar routine of making coffee, talking with customers, and managing the small business that I had built from nothing was therapeutic after the emotional intensity of dealing with family crisis and cultural conflict. But the real healing happened in the quiet moments with Michael, cooking dinner together, taking evening walks in the forest, lying in bed talking about our hopes for the future. We had both changed during our time apart, had both learned things about ourselves and our relationship that we hadn't known before. "I was afraid," Michael admitted one evening as we sat on our porch, watching the northern lights dance across the sky. "Not that you wouldn't come back, but that you would come back different, that the pressure from your family would make you doubt what we have." Did I come back different? He considered the question seriously, studying my face in the soft light. "Yes, but not in the way I was afraid of. You seem more certain about us, more confident in your choices, like you've finally stopped apologizing for who you are." He was right. The time in Morocco had been difficult, but it had also been clarifying. I had spent 6 months defending my identity and my relationship in the most challenging possible context, and I had emerged with unshakable conviction about the life I wanted to live. "I want to marry you," I said suddenly, the words coming out before I had consciously decided to say them. Michael looked at me with surprise, then with a smile that started small and grew until it transformed his entire face. "Finland doesn't have marriage equality yet," he said practically, though his eyes were bright with emotion. "Not legal marriage, maybe, but I want to make a commitment, a public declaration that this is permanent, that we're building something that's meant to last." I took his hands in mine. "I want everyone to know that you're my family now, my chosen family, and that I choose you every day for the rest of my life." "Yes," he said simply, in that direct way that was so characteristic of him. "Yes, I want that too." Planning a commitment ceremony in a village of 300 people turned out to be both simpler and more complex than I had anticipated. Simple because the logistics were straightforward. We would have the ceremony at the cafe, with a celebration afterward in the community center. Complex because we wanted to honor both of our backgrounds while creating something that felt authentically ours. The ceremony itself was small and intimate. Paavo, the elderly man who had welcomed me to the village, agreed to officiate. We wrote our own vows, promising to support each other's dreams, to be honest even when it was difficult, and to build a life together that honored both of our histories while creating something entirely new. I wore a traditional Moroccan kaftan that my mother had reluctantly sent, despite her disapproval of the ceremony. Michael wore a Finnish folk costume that had belonged to his grandfather. We exchanged rings that he had carved himself from wood from the forest where we had first met. The entire village attended, bringing food and well wishes and treating our commitment with the same respect they would have shown any other wedding. Several people gave speeches about how we had both contributed to the community, how our love had made the village a warmer, more welcoming place. But the moment that meant the most to me came at the end of the evening, when Mrs. Korhonen pulled me aside and handed me a wrapped package. "This is from all of us," she said. "A wedding gift for you and Michael." Inside was a wooden plaque, similar to the one Michael had made for the cafe but larger and more elaborate. It read "Banali Vertainen family," in both Arabic and Finnish script, and below that, "Love makes a home. For your house," she explained. "So everyone knows that you belong here, that this is your home now." I found myself crying then, overwhelmed by the acceptance and love this community had shown us. These people, who had started as strangers in a foreign country, had become my family in the truest sense of the word. As Michael and I walked home that night, still wearing our ceremonial clothes and carrying gifts from our neighbors, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. I had come to Finland running from one life and had stumbled into another. I had found love when I wasn't looking for it, had built a family from scratch in a place where I had expected only solitude. "Any regrets?" Michael asked, echoing our conversation from months earlier. "None," I said, and meant it completely. "You? Only that it took us so long to get here." We spent our wedding night in the apartment above the cafe, surrounded by the scents of coffee and cardamom, listening to the wind in the pine trees outside our window. And as I fell asleep in the arms of my husband, not legally, perhaps, but in every way that mattered, I felt the deep contentment that comes from knowing you've found your place in the world. The years that followed were filled with the kind of ordinary happiness that I had never thought possible during my restless youth in Morocco. The cafe continued to thrive, becoming a destination for tourists interested in authentic Arctic experiences. Michael's work with sustainable forestry gained international recognition, and he began consulting on projects throughout Scandinavia. We traveled together when we could to Helsinki and Stockholm, to other remote villages in Lapland, and eventually, when relations with my family had healed somewhat, to Morocco, where Michael charmed my mother with his respectful curiosity about our culture and his obvious devotion to me. But mostly, we were content with the quiet rhythms of life in Korkeasaari. Morning coffee before work, evening walks in the forest, long conversations that lasted until the midnight sun rose again. We learned that love isn't just about the dramatic moments of crisis and choice, but about the daily decision to show up for each other, to build something together that's larger than either person could create alone. And in that small village in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by coffee beans and pine trees, two men from completely different worlds discovered that home isn't a place you're born into. It's something you create with the person you choose to love.